The morning Celia Abrams buried her mother, her brothers were already doing the math. She saw it in the way Darnell looked at the house when they pulled into the driveway after the repast. Not the way a son looks at the place where he grew up. The way a man looks at something he is trying to price. Quick eyes, measuring, moving across the front porch, the roof, the yard, and then back to his phone like he was checking something. Celia did not say anything. 14 months later, she would sit across the street in her car and watch a stranger hang curtains in her mother's bedroom window. Light blue curtains, not the ones Velma had chosen. Someone had replaced them. And that was the moment Celia understood exactly what her silence had cost her. But that was 14 months away. Right now, she was still standing in the yard of the only home she had ever known, watching her brother calculate the value of a place he had not slept in for 14 years, and she was telling herself she was wrong about what she was seeing. She was not wrong. Velma Abrams died on a Tuesday morning in February 2024. She was 83 years old. She died in the bedroom she had shared with Elias for 41 years, in the house on Dennison Avenue in Birmingham, where all 4 of her children had been born and raised. Celia was holding her hand when she went, the same way she had held it through the dementia diagnosis in 2016. Through the falls, the confusion, the nights when Velma called out for Elias, even though Elias had been gone 5 years already, and Celia had to answer to that name just to keep her mother calm enough to sleep. Darnell had not been there for any of that. Neither had Leroy. Phyllis had come twice. Christmas 2019, and a long weekend in 2021 when she said she needed a break from her life in Atlanta. She had stayed 4 days, rearranged the kitchen cupboards without asking, and left on a Sunday afternoon saying she would be back soon. She was not back soon. Celia had been the one who stayed. She had always been the one who stayed. When Elias's business started declining in the years after the fire, it was Celia who drove him to the bank meetings. When Velma's memory began to slip, it was Celia who attended the doctor appointments and learned the medication schedules and built the daily routine that kept her mother's world small enough to be manageable and safe enough to feel like home. She had given up the apartment she rented on the east side of Birmingham. She had given up the office manager position at the medical practice on Fifth Avenue, where she had worked for 20 years and where her supervisor had once told her she was the most organized person he had ever employed. She had given up quiet mornings and uninterrupted sleep, and the version of her life that belonged only to her. She had given up the man she had been seeing in 2017, a quiet man named Gerald who had waited 8 months before finally saying he could not keep coming second to a house that was not his. She had understood. She had not argued. She had gone back to Dennison Avenue and made Velma's dinner and told herself that some sacrifices were just the shape of love. She had given all of it to Dennison Avenue, to the yellow house with the green shutters her father had painted himself in 1991, to the kitchen where Velma made cornbread every Sunday, even after she forgot the names of people she had known for decades, to the parents who needed her in a way that her siblings had decided, each in their own way and their own time, that they could not afford. Celia had stayed for 15 years. She was 63 years old. She had nothing to show for it that any bank or court or government document would recognize as real. No salary, no contract, no deed with her name on it. Just 15 years of her life poured into 2 people who deserved it, and a house that still smelled like Velma's cornbread and Elias's motor oil and everything Celia had ever understood as home. She should have known what was coming. She had known Darnell her whole life. But grief does something to your defenses. It opens a door in you that you would normally keep locked. And while that door was open, Darnell walked through it. Elias Abrams started Abrams Fleet and Auto in 1984 with a single hydraulic lift, a set of hand tools, and a reputation he had spent 6 years building as a mechanic at a shop on 6th Avenue that paid him half of what he was worth and gave him none of the credit. He was 47 years old when he opened his own doors. Velma had pressed his shirts the night before. She had made him a thermos of coffee and told him he was the most capable man she had ever known, and that she had always known this day was coming, and that the only thing left was for him to go do it. He did it. For 25 years, Abrams Fleet and Auto kept Birmingham moving. Delivery trucks and church vans and school transportation contractors and city fleet vehicles. He was not famous. He was not the kind of man who got written about in newspapers or honored at civic ceremonies. He was the kind of man who showed up when your fleet was grounded and your operation was bleeding money by the hour. He fixed the problem, charged you fairly, and never once made you feel small for needing him. He also helped people who could not yet afford to need him. Bernard Coles came to Elias in 1998 with 2 trucks, a contract he had won from a regional grocery chain, and a maintenance bill he could not pay. He was 29 years old and 2 weeks from losing everything. Elias looked at him, serviced both vehicles, and deferred the payment with no interest and no deadline. He said a man who had earned a contract like that deserved a chance to build on it. August Fielding was 24 in 2001 when he showed up asking whether Elias knew anyone who needed a part-time driver. Elias spent 45 minutes on the phone connecting him to 3 fleet operators he trusted. He asked for nothing in return. Nathaniel Fitch was a former city fleet manager with a logistics company idea and no starting capital. Elias sat with him for 2 hours after closing, went through the plan line by line, and then called 4 people from the contact book he kept in the bottom drawer of his office desk. 2 of those calls became Nathaniel Fitch's first clients. Elias kept everyone's name in that book. Every person he had helped. Every debt owed and extended. Every connection made and every favor given. 40 pages of his handwriting, small and careful, the kind of writing a man produces when he understands that what he is recording matters. By the time Celia would find it, the house would already be gone. Darnell never cared about any of that. He had driven past the factory building once in 2021, glanced at it through the car window, and said it was not worth the taxes. He did not think about it again. That mistake would cost him everything. The fire came on a Thursday night in March 2009. Electrical fault in the main workshop. The insurance payout covered less than half of what had been lost. The bank declined to refinance. Elias closed Abrams Fleet and Auto in June 2009, at the age of 72, 3 months after the fire. He had one asset the bankruptcy could not touch. The factory building on Pratt Road, purchased personally in 1989, never transferred into the business entity. It passed to Velma when he died in 2019. It would pass to the estate when Velma was gone. What Darnell looked at was the house on Dennison Avenue. While Celia was learning how to keep her mother alive, Darnell was already preparing paperwork. The family meeting happened 9 days after the funeral. Darnell sat at the head of the dining room table in the house where he had not slept a single night in 14 years and spoke about the estate with the confidence of a man who had been doing calculations for weeks. The house needed to go to probate, he said, and once it cleared, it needed to be sold. His voice had the measured patience of someone explaining something simple to someone slow. Celia sat across from him. She had been living in this house for years, she said. She had maintained it. She had paid the utilities and handled the repairs, and kept it standing while their parents were inside, it needing to be kept alive. Darnell nodded like he had heard this argument before. He said that was appreciated. He said everyone understood what Celia had done. He said the estate still needed to be handled properly, and that sentiment did not change math. Darnell was not entirely wrong about the house having value. It was worth money. What he did not understand, what he had never once tried to understand, was what it had cost to keep it standing. And that difference between what something is worth and what it cost was the entire distance between who he was and who Celia was. Leroy looked at the table. Phyllis looked at her hands. She had noticed something in Darnell's voice that she could not fully name. A certainty that felt like more than confidence. Something had already been decided before this meeting started. She could feel it. But not knowing felt easier than asking. So she looked at her hands and said nothing. It was the most expensive silence of her life. Everyone tells themselves a story they can live with. That was hers. Celia said she would need time to consult with someone, and that she did not think any decision should be made in the first 2 weeks after their mother's burial. Darnell said he understood. He said there was no rush. He was already lying. He had found a notary. He had found a deed template. He had forged a transfer document backdated to November 2023, 3 months before Velma died. That made it appear Velma had voluntarily transferred the Dennison Avenue property to her 3 children as a gift. The document carried Velma's signature. Velma had not signed it. Velma had not been capable of signing anything meaningful in November 2023. Velma had been sleeping 14 hours a day in the bedroom on the second floor, while Celia managed her medications, changed her sheets, and told her that Elias would be home soon. Darnell had Leroy sign as a witness. Leroy signed because Darnell told him it was a probate shortcut their attorney had approved. Leroy did not ask to see the attorney. Leroy never asked questions when Darnell had already decided. That was the thing about Leroy. He had spent his whole life mistaking his brother's certainty for expertise. Phyllis was told the transfer was legitimate. Sandra Kimball purchased the house on Dennison Avenue in April 2025 for $187,000. She was a retired school teacher from Tuscaloosa who had spent 4 years saving for this purchase. She hired an inspector. She hired a title company. The forged documents appeared clean because Darnell had been careful and because the title examiner had no reason to doubt a document that looked properly executed. Sandra Kimball signed her closing papers on a Tuesday morning, believing she was the legal owner of a house she had saved her whole retirement to afford. The $187,000 was divided 3 ways. Celia received nothing because Celia was not named in the forged transfer document. Darnell had removed her before the ink was dry. Celia found out in May 2025. She drove to Dennison Avenue just as she had driven there 1,000 times. Same turn off Center Street. Same slight dip before the Dennison intersection. Same view of the yellow house from half a block away. Except the yellow house now had light blue curtains in the upstairs window. Not the ones Velma had chosen. Someone had replaced them. She pulled to the curb across the street and stopped the car. Sandra Kimball's car was in the driveway. A child's bicycle was propped against the porch railing. A potted plant sat on the front step where Velma's worn welcome mat used to be. Celia's hands stayed on the steering wheel longer than they needed to, because letting go meant accepting it. She looked at that upstairs window for a long time. She had changed the sheets in that room for 7 years. She had sat in that room through nights that had no end. She had held her mother's hand in that room on the last morning of Velma's life, and the window had been letting in February light, and the curtains had been the ones Velma chose, cream-colored with a small flower pattern, and now they were gone. She reached into her bag out of habit, looking for the house key she had carried for 15 years. Her fingers found it. She held it in her palm. A key that no longer opened anything, and nowhere left that remembered her. A key to a door that now belonged to a woman who had done nothing wrong and lost nothing she had not already been compensated for. And that was the part that made it impossible to be angry at Sandra Kimball. The anger had a specific address. It had a name. 2 names. She put the key back in her bag. She sat in that car for a long time, not crying, not moving, just sitting with the full weight of what 15 years looked like when it was reduced to nothing that any document in the world would acknowledge. Then something shifted in her. Not acceptance, not surrender. Something quieter and more dangerous than either of those things. She had nowhere to go. No salary, no savings beyond a thin buffer, no lease in her name anywhere in Birmingham. She had given everything to Dennison Avenue, and Dennison Avenue was gone. She drove to the factory. The building on Pratt Road had been sitting empty for 16 years. Elias had kept the property taxes paid until the day he died, and Celia had continued paying them because it was what her father would have wanted. The main workshop was gutted. The fire had taken that completely. But the small office wing at the back, the room where Elias had kept his desk and his phone and his books, was intact, weathered and stripped of anything valuable. But standing, there was a cot in the corner that had been there since 2009, a desk with 2 broken drawers, a window that looked out over the overgrown yard where the workshop used to be, and there was a bed, a narrow iron bed pushed against the back wall that Elias had kept for the nights when a job ran late. Celia dragged her suitcase through the door, sat down on the cot, and looked at the room that smelled like old metal and her father's life and 16 years of silence. She was 63 years old. That night she lay on the cot fully dressed, not because she was tired, but because there was nothing left to undress for. No home to settle into. No routine to follow. There was no one left who needed her to be anything. Just the dark and the smell of old metal and the sound of Birmingham continuing without her. She slept in her clothes because the cot had no bedding. The first full day she cleaned. It was the only thing that felt like control. She swept 16 years of dust from the floor. She opened the window and let the Birmingham air come through. She wiped down the desk. She cleared the broken drawers and stacked them against the wall. On the second morning, she moved the iron bed away from the wall to sweep behind it. She saw the shoebox before she fully registered what it was. She almost left it, assumed it was old parts records from the final years of the business. She started to push the bed back. Then she stopped. She pulled the box out slowly and set it on the desk. She stood looking at it for a moment before she opened it, because some part of her already understood that the careful way her father had lived his life meant that nothing he left behind was left behind by accident. She opened it, and for a moment she did not breathe. Inside was a notebook, black cover, spiral bound, filled from front to back with her father's handwriting. Small and careful, the kind of writing a man produces when he understands that what he is recording matters. She turned to the first page. A name, a date, an amount, a note in parentheses that said simply, "Good man, helped him start." She turned through the pages slowly. 40 pages, hundreds of entries spanning 1987 to 2008. People who owed money, people Elias had connected to opportunities, people he had helped at moments when they had nothing but the start of something. Amounts ranging from $300 to $40,000. Notes about what the money was for and what he believed each person was capable of. She had no house. She had no salary. She had a cot with no bedding and a key that opened nothing and a factory office that smelled like her father's whole life. Her brothers had taken the house, but they had left behind the only thing that could build another one. On the inside back cover, in handwriting shakier than the entries, written later, she could tell by the ink, was a single sentence. "Everything I built is in there. Somebody will need it someday." Celia sat on the floor of her father's office with the notebook open in her lap and understood something she had not understood before. Her brothers had looked at everything Elias Abrams owned and seen a broken factory and a house on Dennison Avenue. They had taken the house because it was the thing that looked like money. They were not wrong that it had value. They were wrong about what the most valuable thing was. The most valuable thing Elias Abrams ever owned was not property. It was who he had been to people. And it had been sitting under a bed her brothers never once looked under. Because they had never stayed long enough to sleep in that office. Because they had never understood that some things can only be found by the people who never leave. She called Mrs. Luella Sampson that evening. Mrs. Luella Sampson was 78 years old, sharp as January, and had known Velma Abrams since 1971. She picked up on the second ring the way women of her generation always picked up, fully present, no preamble. Celia told her where she was. There was a silence on the line. Not surprise. Something older than surprise. Mrs. Luella Sampson said she knew that office. She had been in it once. September 2009. She had driven Elias there herself on the day the bankruptcy was finalized because he had asked her not to tell Velma where he was going, and she was the only person outside the family he trusted with that kind of request. She had sat with him while he packed the last things from the desk. She had watched him take the notebook from the bottom drawer and place it under the bed. She had asked him why under the bed. He had looked at her the way Elias Abrams looked at things he had already decided, steady and complete. He said he was not ready to carry it home yet. He said when the right person needed it, they would find it. He said everything he had built was in there, and somebody would need it someday. Celia held the phone without speaking for a long moment. He knew, she said finally. He always knew. Then she asked Mrs. Luella Sampson if she would come to the office on Saturday. Mrs. Luella Sampson said she would bring food. The call started on a Monday. Celia had spent the previous week going through the notebook page by page, cross-referencing names against business registrations and current addresses, working from the desk in the factory office with a legal pad beside her the way she had worked through 20 years of medical practice accounts. She was organized. She had always been organized. It was the thing she was built for. Bernard Coles was the first name she called. $40,000, deferred with no interest, 1998. The note beside it said, 2 trucks, good contract, needs a runway. Bernard Coles now ran a regional carrier across 5 Alabama counties. Fleet of 22 vehicles. 40 employees. A business that had grown steadily for 25 years from the runway Elias Abrams had given him when he was 29 and 2 weeks from losing everything. She introduced herself. She told him she was Elias's daughter. She told him she had found the notebook. The silence on the other end lasted long enough that she thought the line had dropped. Then Bernard Coles said he had thought about Elias Abrams more times than he could count. He said there was not a year since 1998 when he had not thought about what her father had done for him and wished he had found a way to honor it. He said the debt was old and legally gone, and he knew that. He said that was not the point. He asked her what she needed. Celia told him the truth. All of it. The house on Dennison Avenue. The forged documents. Sandra Kimball's curtains in the windows of her mother's house. The factory office. The cot. The shoebox. She did not perform the pain. She just stated it the way her father would have, directly and completely. Bernard Coles said he would have a check to her by the end of the week. He said the amount would reflect not just what was owed, but what 27 years of interest looked like when the rate was gratitude. He said if there was anything else she needed, she was to call him first. She called August Fielding on Wednesday. Fielding now ran a fuel distribution company across Central and North Alabama. He had built it from the driver's seat of someone else's truck to the boardroom in 24 years. He remembered the 45 minutes Elias spent on the phone for him in 2001. He said those calls had changed the direction of his life, and he had never been able to find the right way to say so. He offered Celia a position running his operations administration, salary, benefits, and a stake in the company's next growth phase. Not charity. He said he had needed someone with her exact background for 2 years and had not found the right person. He said the right person had apparently been kept occupied on Dennison Avenue. She called Nathaniel Fitch on Thursday. Fitch had built his transportation logistics company into a firm with contracts across the southeastern United States. He said he had attended Elias's funeral in 2019 and had not known how to approach the family afterward. He said he had wanted to, but had not found the courage in time. He asked her what she wanted to build. She told him about the factory building, about the elderly residents she had watched come through her parents' final years with nowhere good to go and no care they could afford, about the way her father had spent his life providing an essential service to people who needed it, charging them fairly, never making them feel small. Nathaniel Fitch said he would fund the startup. He said Elias Abrams had looked at a business plan sketch in 2003 and made 4 phone calls based on nothing but his judgment about who Nathaniel Fitch was as a person. He said he could do the same for Elias's daughter. He said, "What do you need to start?" The title insurance company that had covered Sandra Kimball's purchase had a legal department that moved with the efficiency of people who understood exactly what was at stake when a fraudulent deed appeared in their portfolio. Celia had retained an attorney. Not to fight for the house herself, she did not have to. The moment the title company's investigators confirmed the forgery and traced the backdated transfer document to Darnell's signature on the notarization, the machine Darnell had set in motion by being careless and greedy began to run in a direction he had not anticipated. The charges were filed in June 2025: deed fraud, felony forgery, wire fraud, and the charge that carried the heaviest weight in an Alabama courtroom: elder financial abuse. The forged signature belonged to a woman with documented cognitive decline. The prosecution had Velma's medical records. They had her dementia diagnosis from 2016. They had her attending physician's notes from November 2023, stating that she was not capable of executing legal documents. They had Darnell's notarization claiming she had signed voluntarily and with full understanding. Leroy's attorney negotiated a plea in exchange for testimony. It did not save him from prison. It only shortened the sentence. He had spent his whole life following Darnell's lead and trusting his brother's certainty for expertise. And in the end, that trust had delivered him to a courtroom in Birmingham with his name on a forged document. Darnell went to trial. His attorney argued he had believed the transfer was legitimate, that he had relied on advice that the document was legally sound. The jury heard Velma's medical records. They heard what November 2023 had actually looked like inside the house on Dennison Avenue. They heard what Celia had been doing in that house while Darnell was preparing transfer documents. They deliberated for less than 4 hours. The house was returned to the estate through the court's restitution order. Sandra Kimball was made whole by the title insurance company. She had done everything right. She had saved for 4 years and hired professionals and trusted a process. None of what happened to her was her fault. The court made sure the people whose fault it was paid for it. Darnell and Leroy were sentenced in October 2025. Phyllis was not charged. She had not signed the documents. She had received her share of the money and spent it in the way people spend money they receive through a transaction they chose not to examine too closely. The law had nothing for her. That was a different kind of sentence. She would have to live inside the knowledge of what she had chosen, and some mornings that knowledge would be very loud. They came back in November 2025, 18 months after the house had sold. Not together. Leroy came first, and he did not come to find Celia. He called, and she let it go to voicemail, and she listened to the message once. He said he was sorry. He said Darnell had told him it was legal. He said he should have asked more questions. The apology was real enough. Apologies always became real once the consequences arrived. Phyllis called 2 weeks later. Her voice was different from the voice that had rearranged the kitchen cupboards in 2021. Smaller. She said she had nothing left from the money. She said she was embarrassed. She said she did not know what she expected Celia to say, but she had needed to call. Celia listened to the whole call. Then she said she heard her. She said she hoped Phyllis would find her footing. She said she needed time, and that time was what she had to offer right now and nothing more. She hung up. It was not cruelty. It was the exact amount of truth the situation required. There are things that sorry cannot reach, and 15 years is one of them. Darnell did not call. Darnell was still constructing a version of events in which he had been treated unfairly. Some people never stop building that case. They take it with them to places where no one can argue back. The renovation of the Pratt Road building began in January 2026. Bernard Coles connected her to a contractor he trusted. August Fielding's company handled fleet logistics at operating cost. Nathaniel Fitch's funding covered the structural work and the initial licensing application. 6 more people from Elias's contact book contributed in ways that ranged from cash to connections to showing up on a Saturday morning with tools and no explanation other than that they had owed Elias Abrams something for a long time, and this was how they were paying it. Celia managed all of it herself. 20 years of medical practice administration had prepared her for exactly this. Mrs. Luella Sampson came to the building on the first warm Saturday in March. She walked through every room slowly. She looked at the walls already painted and the floors refinished and the windows letting Birmingham light in clean and even. She walked to the room at the back, the office where Celia had slept on the cot, where the iron bed still stood against the wall, where the shoebox had been waiting under that bed since 2009. She stood in the doorway of that room for a long time. Celia stood beside her. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Mrs. Luella Sampson said, "Your father always knew this building was for something. He just did not know it yet." Celia looked at the room, at the window, at the bed, at the place where the shoebox had been. He knew, she said. He just could not see it from where he was standing. She had the notebook framed. Not the whole thing. 1 page. The first page. 1 name, 1 date, 1 amount, and the note in her father's careful handwriting. Good man. Helped him start. She hung it in the entrance hall where every resident and every visitor would walk past it on the way in. Above it she had 4 words painted directly on the wall in the same careful lettering her father had used his whole life. Elias and Velma Abrams. Mrs. Luella Sampson had the first room reserved. Cost to her, 0. Non-negotiable. The day the first residents moved in, Celia stood in the entrance hall alone. She looked at the framed page, at her father's handwriting, at the 4 words on the wall. She reached into her bag. She took out the house key, the one that no longer opened anything, the one she had carried for 15 years and found in her palm on the day she sat across the street watching someone else's curtains in her mother's window. She held it for a moment. Then she walked to the wall beside the framed page and placed it there. Not framed, not displayed, just placed. A key against a wall in the building her father had owned, in the institution she had built from his name and his character and 40 pages of his handwriting. The house was gone. The key no longer opened anything. But the thing her father had left her was opening doors everywhere. Elias Abrams had spent 25 years keeping Birmingham moving. He had fixed what was broken, charged fairly, and helped people build things when the banks and institutions had looked the other way. He had lost his building to a fire and his business to a system that was not designed to catch him when he fell. He had put a notebook under a bed in September 2009 and trusted that somebody would need it someday. His daughter had needed it. She had found it. She had done with it exactly what he would have done. She had called the people in it. She had told the truth. She had built something that served the people who needed serving, charged them what they could actually afford, and never once made anyone feel small for needing it. Darnell had taken the house. Leroy had signed the paper. They had divided the money and spent it on things that were already gone. For 15 years, she gave everything and got nothing back. This was the first time something gave back. They had missed what mattered. The same way people always miss what matters when they can only see what something is worth on a document. They look at the building and miss the book under the bed. They look at the house and miss the 40 pages of a man's life work. They take the surface and leave behind the foundation without understanding that the foundation is the only part that lasts. They took what they could sell. She kept what they could never understand. You cannot steal what you cannot see. And that is where they lost. You cannot sell what was never for sale. And you cannot take what was already given carefully, quietly, across 40 pages of a man's handwriting to the person who earned it by staying. Here is the question. If the people who took everything from you came back with nothing, would you help them? Or would you finally let life collect the debt? Leave your answer below, because this one is going to divide this comment section straight down the middle. If this story reminded you that what cannot be stolen is always worth more than what can, send it to someone who needs to hear that today. Subscribe to the Storytelling King. See you in the next video. Love you all.